This fertile wooded valley is a land of giants. In it, one creature rules above all others, a highly evolved killer. For 1 million years, this top predator has lived unchallenged. It is Smilodon fatalis, the saber-tooth. But this formidable animal, with no predator to fear and plentiful game to eat, is about to disappear forever. 11,000 years later, a city of freeways and skyscrapers has arisen from the valley. Yet it has not totally obliterated all traces of the saber-tooth. Evidence still remains beneath downtown Los Angeles. The Rancho La Brea tar pits is one of the world's most extraordinary fossil sites. These pools of tar contain a record of life stretching back into the Ice Age. Paleontologists have unearthed millions of fossilized bones. For Blair Van Valkenburg, it's a gold mine.
Believe it or not, this black swamp that I'm standing in the middle of is a paleontologist's dream. I mean, it is hard to believe looking at it, but it is chock-a-block with bone. I mean, from all the tar pits that are in this small area, there are over 4 million specimens that have been found. Things as small as rodents and as large as mammoths.
This paleontologist's dream is the result of an accident of ancient geology. Tar seeps from under the earth through cracks caused by California's frequent earthquakes. Pools of deadly oil form just below the surface.
10,000 years ago, you're a thirsty animal, and you might walk out, approach that water, and because you're a rather large and heavy animal, you'd find your feet sinking, and you would struggle, but that would actually probably drive you deeper as you struggled, and pretty soon you'd be in a position from which you were no longer able to get yourself out of.
It would have been a slow, agonizing death.
And even today, we see things getting stuck. It's not that this process stopped 10,000 years ago. It's still happening. You can see the tar coming up on the surface. And over here, you can see a little yellow-rumped warbler that probably innocently saw some water or saw a bug on the surface and swooped down to get it and never took off again.
Tar is one of nature's great preservatives. So even the smallest of bones remain.
Paleontologists can reconstruct the past using the bones of the animals that they find, especially when they're beautifully preserved, as they are at Rancho La Brea. You can reconstruct the strength of the animal, you can reconstruct the size of the animal, you can reconstruct its feeding habits from its teeth. The preservation at La Brea allows us to reconstruct the entire fauna with relative ease.
But Rancho La Brea is famous for reconstructing one creature above all others, the saber-tooth. Over 2,000 of them have been recovered.
Now we can probably guess that this might be a female. It's hard to tell because female and male saber-tooths were about the same size. So we'd need to really do a lot of detailed measurements to actually figure that out. And it really illustrates how well the tar preserves these fossils. There's just no distortion. The cat is very beautifully preserved, and it's very easy for us to think about them moving around the landscape here, recreating, at least for a paleontologist, it's easy to recreate them in our own mind and see them roaming the plains of Los Angeles some 11,000 years ago.
This female saber-tooth is 9 years old. She's very similar to a male cat, up to 1 meter high at the shoulder and the weight of 4 men. She's tracking her prey, searching for the scent left by large game like bison or horses. The saber-tooth is often thought of simply as a lion with big teeth, but it's a very different animal. She's twice as heavy as a modern lion, built more like a bear with stocky muscular shoulders, shortened hind legs and a stunted tail, all designed to deliver power to her killer canines. So why did the saber-tooth evolve its bizarre body and even stranger teeth? And is there a link between them and the animal's extinction?
Obviously, one of the most remarkable things about saber-toothed cats are these saber-like canine teeth that they have. And these are the longest canine teeth of any carnivore that ever existed, at least for the size of the cat. They're definitely the longest. And they're very sharp, actually, on the back edge, and they're narrow from side to side and knife-like in cross-section.
Clearly, the teeth were vicious weapons, but little is understood about how the saber-tooth used them to kill. To find out means looking at the muscular structure of the entire body. But there's a problem. The tar pits preserve bone, not muscle. So one paleontologist has turned to modern cats to investigate this. The nearest match isn't a speedy runner like a cheetah, but the slower moving jaguar. This zoo animal died of natural causes. Now it's helping Virginia Naples to find out how its ancient saber-toothed relative actually behaved as a predator.
The biggest mystery about saber-toothed cats is how an animal with very long and very sharp, but very thin and brittle teeth could have been able to make a bite without these teeth being broken. And how were they able to use their muscles in order to generate enough force to make the bite?
Understanding how the jaguar's biting muscles attach to the skull allows Virginia to compare the awesome power of the saber-tooth's bite.
The saber-toothed cat skull, in addition to being larger than the jaguar skull, is different in shape, and you've got much greater space here for this muscle than you do in this animal. So we can assume this muscle was bigger and therefore could exert more force than the corresponding muscle in the jaguar, which would help to give this animal a stronger bite.
The skull also reveals the mouth could have opened some 30 degrees wider than the jaguar and other modern cats to administer the killing bite. The shape of the skull and the heavy body both show the creature had evolved to ambush lone animals.
We've got an animal here with very heavy limbs, short legs. It would not have been a sprinter. It would have had to hide in ambush and sneak up on its prey. This animal was much bigger, relatively speaking much heavier, with even heavier muscles. If this animal could not run particularly fast, this animal would have been even more dependent upon hiding from its prey and then pouncing on it at the last minute.
A lone bison has moved into the female's hunting ground in search of fresh grazing. Without the protection of a herd, it's exposed to a terrible risk. The female saber-tooth is hungry, and she has 2 new cubs to feed. Her massive bulk means she can eat around 30 kilograms of meat in one go. As a slow runner, good cover is vital to the success of her ambush. If she can pounce, she's capable of severing a bison's jugular and crushing its windpipe with a single bite. Yet even for a predator as deadly as the saber-tooth, ambush hunting is a high-risk strategy. She's paid a price for her kill, injuring her back while wrestling the 2-ton bison to the ground. Proof that hunting could take a heavy toll on saber-tooths comes from the bones found at La Brea. Paleopathologist Chris Shaw finds hundreds of similar injuries on saber-tooth bones, many of which he thinks were caused by bringing down large prey.
Being a large vicious carnivore is an awfully risky business, no matter where you are in the world. We have this very nice example of a pelvis of a saber-toothed cat. This side is normally developed, looks and shape is very normal. On the other side, however, we have a very traumatic injury. What happened here was that the thigh bone itself had dislocated from the joint, and there was complete destruction of cartilage, which affected this area by bacteria getting in here and causing a massive infection.
Over 5,000 mangled saber-tooth bones have been found at La Brea. For Chris, they are not only evidence of the high-risk hunting strategies saber-tooths pursued, but how group behavior may have evolved to help injured animals.
The incredible thing is that these crippling injuries did not kill these animals. What killed these animals was the La Brea tar pits, getting entrapped in the La Brea tar pits. To me, these injuries indicate that these animals were social animals, and being part of a social group affords these really seriously injured individuals the opportunity to feed at group kills and also to be protected by the rest of the group.
Several hours have passed since the kill, and the injured female has eaten her fill. She's joined by her cubs. While they eat, she nurses her wounds. A male comes along. He's her 2-year-old son. She tolerates his presence. In fact, this social behavior helps defend the kill from scavengers, until they've all eaten their fill. The saber-tooth thrived as long as there was prey and adequate cover from which to attack it. But while life seems abundant, this saber-tooth family are already facing a threat that will prove decisive. Around them, their valley home is changing, and their reign as the top predator is about to end forever. Having reigned as top predator for 1 million years, this saber-tooth, along with the rest of her species, is suddenly facing extinction. The fossil record at the La Brea tar pits reveals that a catastrophe overwhelmed many species. Not just the saber-tooth, but many other animals disappeared too.
About 11,000 years ago, something strange happened, and we find no more of these saber-tooths anymore in this tar pit or anywhere else in North America. And lost alongside them are the dire wolves and the mastodons, the mammoths, the camels, the horses, all the things they preyed upon. In fact, this saber-tooth is probably one of the last saber-tooth cats that existed in North America.
In this land of giants, many of the largest animals, like the mammoth, died out. Dating their remains shows this coincided exactly with the end of the last ice age. For 100,000 years, global temperatures had been around 10 degrees Celsius colder than today. But by 11,000 years ago, the climate was warming up. In Arizona's Sonoran Desert, paleobotanist Julio Betancourt has discovered compelling evidence, revealing what conditions were like when the saber-tooth ruled, and the drastic change that was about to overwhelm it. Today, the Sonoran Desert is very dry, but Julio's discovery reveals that it wasn't always like this. And evidence for this comes from an unlikely animal, the pack rat. This seemingly unremarkable rodent reveals a major environmental change was unfolding at the same time as the saber-tooth disappeared. All because of how its ancestors built their nests 12,000 years ago.
Well, here's what all the excitement is about. This is actually a pack rat nest right here that was occupied by a pack rat, in this particular case, about 12,000 years ago. Pack rats use these rock shelters for cover, and they bring in a lot of plant material from about 50 meters, 60 meters away.
The plants the pack rat built its nest from have been preserved in a unique way.
The pack rat oftentimes pees all over these piles of plant remains, and as the urine evaporates, it crystallizes and holds all of this material together like amber.
But most significantly, the preserved plant remains confirm forests grew here during the Ice Age when it was colder and wetter.
The beauty of it is that the preservation is actually exquisite. We see here, for example, that there are the needles or the leaves of a pine. We also have junipers and oaks. So we know that there were pine, juniper, and oak woodlands covering most of the Sonoran Desert at the end of the last ice age before big herbivores and things like saber-tooth tigers became extinct.
But the pack rat evidence from 1,000 years later tells a very different story. The pine and oak forests were disappearing. The Ice Age was coming to an end, heralding massive environmental changes that continue till this day.
So the overall trend for the southwestern United States and Southern California since the last ice age has been towards hotter, drier environments and towards more desert vegetation.
But how could changing vegetation be linked to the extinction of a carnivore like the saber-tooth? While the change didn't affect the female and her cubs directly, it did affect their food supply in vital ways. Ironically, paleoecologist Greg MacDonald believes it actually increased it.
The biggest mystery that we have to look at is the fact that not everything goes extinct, that you have animals that do survive. Here in North America, you have mammoths, mastodons, horses, they all disappeared. And yet other groups of animals, like the North American antelope, the American bison, a lot of those animals did survive and did quite well, increased in numbers and spread out.
Horses didn't return until Spanish conquistadors reintroduced them a mere 500 years ago. Scientists must explain their extinction, and also why the bison survived and thrived. To solve this puzzle, Greg must investigate how different animals coped with the changing vegetation. This is not a job for the squeamish.
Talking about why some animals became extinct and other ones survived, one of the clues that we can look at is actually in their dung. If we tear apart the droppings of a buffalo and look at the plant fibers inside, we can see that they're very fine, and that's because they chew their food twice. If we look at horses, animals with a simple stomach, you can see that the plant material is much coarser. What this means is that buffalo, the ruminants, get a lot more nutrition out of the plant material than what the simple stomached animals like the horse can do.
As the variety and nutritional value of plant life changed, it now seems the ruminants had an inbuilt evolutionary advantage.
The variety of plants that's living in an area is changing, and this probably creates a crisis, and those animals that are better at getting the nutrients out survive, like the bison, whereas those that are not as good are going extinct, like the horse.
But for the saber-tooth, the proliferation of bison means hard times. Despite the fact she's beautifully designed as an ambush predator, she's becoming peculiarly vulnerable. In drier, more open country, there's less cover, and she'll struggle to hunt using her highly evolved ambush skills. She'll need to chase down her prey, but she simply isn't built for speed. Bison farmer Larry Toller appreciates how hard it is to hunt bison.
To kill a bison is damned hard. They don't like to separate from each other. They stay as a very close, tight-knit group. They protect the babies. To get one separated is almost impossible because the herd doesn't want it to happen.
The ability to hunt successfully, always a tricky business, was now even more difficult. Not only was there less cover to ambush from, Fossil discoveries show Greg MacDonald that the bison were evolving a powerful new defense mechanism.
One of the things that we see happens is they become smaller. This does have advantages though, because a smaller animal does not require as much food for survival, and you can pack more animals into a given area, which means you can have larger herds, which has the advantage of more eyes, more animals on the watch out for predators.
The growth of large bison herds was another terrible blow to the saber-tooth's chances of survival. As the Ice Age ended, solitary prey is hard to find. Many prey species have disappeared. Others, like bison, have safety in numbers. So while there's plenty of meat on the hoof, catching it is very hard for an ambush predator. Despite being beautifully designed to pounce and kill, now everything is working against her. In bigger groups, the bison spot danger more easily across the open land. They've seen her coming and can easily outrun her. Superb adaptation to an Ice Age environment didn't help the female saber-tooth once that environment changed. In a different world, the predator at the top of the food chain is even more vulnerable to annihilation. Starving, the female saber-tooth has had to abandon her cubs. She'll never reproduce again. Forced to survive on carrion, the smell of rotting flesh lures her to the deadly tar pit. Hunger overpowers her sense of caution and drives her to the edge of the black abyss. In the struggle to survive, evolution has produced millions of creatures. Yet 99.9% of them are extinct. What killed off the seemingly impregnable mammoth? Why did lethal predators like the saber-tooth perish? What destroyed the giant Irish elk? This series investigates 6 remarkable animals and the causes of their extinction. Was nature or man to blame? Were they unfit or just unlucky? Is the history of life on Earth really the history of death? In September 1598, the crew of the Dutch East Indiaman, the Amsterdam, was saved from certain death. Hit by a savage storm off the Cape of Good Hope, they'd been blown into the uncharted waters of the Indian Ocean. By chance, currents carried them within sight of a tropical island. The men were half-starved, and the island promised food. But the sailors weren't the only two-legged creatures to have discovered this tropical paradise. Dutch encountered an extraordinary creature. They called it Dodassen, the fat ass. Within 80 years, it would be gone forever. We knew less about it than we did about the dinosaurs. Until now. In modern Mauritius, sugar plantations have replaced the jungle the Dutch explored. Tourists relax where the dodo once lived. But paleontologist Julian Hume is no tourist. He's here to discover what the dodo was like and what happened to it. The problem is, despite its fame, there is very scant evidence. Only a handful of rough sketches of living dodos were made. They were copied, often badly, and incorporated into fanciful paintings, creating the enduring myth of a hapless bird.
In Dutch art, the dodo is portrayed as a fat, clumsy, absurd species, the butt of jokes. It often appeared in fantastical landscapes, such as this one of Orpheus taming animals with his lute. It became a mythical species on par with the griffin and phoenix, and that's partly why it became an icon of extinction.
The dodo seemed so bizarre and comical that by the 18th century, some scientists doubted it had ever existed at all. When Lewis Carroll caricatured the dodo in Alice in Wonderland, the bird finally ended up more surreal than real. But ironically, around the same time, evidence was unearthed that proved it had existed. Dug up in 1865, these are the only complete dodo skeletons in the world. With them, Julian can separate fact from fiction and reconstruct what the dodo was really like.
Now we have the skeleton of the dodo, we can tell so much more about the bird and how it may have appeared in life. Had a long, sinuous neck, quite an upright stance, and probably stood about 2.5 feet tall. This is very different from the picture that's come down to us from the early drawings.
In popular imagination, the dodo is an inept, harmless creature. But the skull tells a different story.
The most incredible feature about the dodo was this extraordinarily large head and bill. The horny tip would have been shed and regrown each year for feeding and for fighting. This would have made this bird very fierce indeed. Above all, the skeleton reveals that this bird was obviously flightless. Had small withered wings, roughly the size of chickens. And to support this huge bulk, it needed strong, robust, sturdy legs.
Yet one myth dies hard. The Dutch nickname Dodassen, fat ass, seems to have been justified.
Because dodos were flightless, they wouldn't have had breast muscles, the important power batteries for flight. So the actual chest would have been quite narrow, and all the weight would have hung underneath, concentrated on the bottom.
But the skeletons tell us nothing about how the bird lived, what it ate, and why ultimately it died out. Pockets of native trees are rare amongst the sugarcane. But for Julian, they're precisely the kind of habitat that might have sustained the dodo. Tall and slender trees leave the forest floor open for feeding.
This Mauritius dry forest was the dodo's world. It's where it fought, fed and bred. It was dominated by these wonderful trees such as ebony, and also by a unique palm flora. These species produced prodigious amounts of fruit throughout the year, and the forest floors would have been covered with them. Species such as hurricane palm, screw pines, bottle palms, and of course ebony. This has almost certainly been the mainstay of the dodo's diet, and armed with that huge bill, it would have swallowed any of these whole.
The dodos are constantly on the lookout for fallen fruit, pouncing on it before competitors arrive. but the dodo may have hunted for other tasty morsels.
Mauritius is a volcanic island and typically has acidic soil. These soils can often lack essential elements such as calcium. During the breeding season, dodos would have required extra amounts of calcium for the production of eggshell, and in order to supplement their diet, I think they would have needed much more than fruit.
Snail shells would have provided a readily available calcium source in the ebony forest. All the evidence is helping to overturn the traditional view of the clumsy dodo. But this is only the start. Until this year, no one was even sure what kind of bird it was. Could it perhaps be a type of ostrich or vulture? The remarkable journey of one particular dodo is the key to solving this mystery. Back in the 17th century, reports of the dodo captured the imagination of Europeans. Dodo mania meant live specimens would fetch high prices, and the Dutch tried to ship them back to Europe. One made it all the way to London, where it was kept as a popular attraction, visited by the diarist Sir Hamon Lestrange.
It was kept in a chamber and was a great fowl bigger than the largest turkey cock, but stouter and thicker and of more erect shape. The keeper called it a dodo.
When it died, this dodo was stuffed and brought to Oxford. Unfortunately, in 1755, a spring-cleaning museum curator threw most of the moth-eaten specimen away. By chance, the shriveled head and one leg were saved. Today, this is the only dodo skin tissue left in the world. Its lucky survival offers an amazing opportunity. Scientists can at last identify what type of bird the dodo actually was. Dr. Beth Shapiro is extracting DNA from the lower leg of the Oxford bird.
It's wonderfully exciting to be able to use DNA techniques to solve a question that's been plaguing naturalists and ornithologists since the dodo was first discovered. With the DNA that I managed to extract from the leg, I was finally able to confirm that the dodo is in fact a pigeon. The dodo is not a separate group at all, in fact belongs in the middle of the pigeons.
But that isn't the only surprise. To discover where the dodo came from, Beth then compared the DNA to that of a range of modern African pigeons, because Africa is the nearest continental landmass to Mauritius.
We were surprised when we finally got the results that it did not, in fact, come out closely related to the pigeons from Africa, but it was most closely related to a pigeon from Southeast Asia.
The dodo's ancestor must have traveled 4,000 miles across the vast Indian Ocean to get to Mauritius.
It's likely that the common ancestor of the dodo was probably from this area in Southeast Asia, because the majority of the pigeons that are in that group have ranges in this area at the moment. That ancestor probably made his way up here down the coast of India here and through this range of sea stacks and volcanic islands, ridges all the way down here to Mauritius Island.
When the dodo's ancestor reached Mauritius, as much as 10 million years ago, it found pigeon paradise. It had no predators, and no longer needing to fly, it evolved into a large ground-dwelling bird. Knowing it was a pigeon provides Julian Hume with a much clearer picture of how the dodo may have behaved.
During breeding season, they would have been very aggressive towards each other. We believe that they had territories, and the males would have defended these territories in order to attract mates and have enough food for the young.
Like other pigeons, males gather up nesting materials within their territory. They'll defend it noisily from all comers.
When two superior males who possibly were fighting over the best territory fought each other, it would have been an amazing sight. There would have been bill tapping, squawking, and eventually that huge bill tip would have been used as a weapon.
Males could do a lot of damage, but this time the newcomer relents. A female is attracted by the commotion.
Pigeons have a ritualized display, and the dodo would have had a ritualized display on a grand scale. The male dodo would have puffed out its chest, and the forest would have resonated with its calls. This wonderful doo-doo-doo-doo.
This male is trying to mesmerize his intended female. The female casts an eye over his nesting material. She'll build a nest in which she'll lay a single egg. The traditional image of the hapless dodo has been turned on its head by recent discoveries. And yet the dodo would soon meet its end. For the first time in 10 million years, it had to contend with a lethal predator. But what happened next is controversial. Did the Dutch really wipe out the dodo? In 1662, 64 years after the Dutch discovery of the island, a German called Volker Iversen was shipwrecked on Mauritius. He walked the length and breadth of the island but saw no dodos. Hungry and weary, he wandered across to a small islet cut off at high tide. This was the last dodo colony that humans ever saw. By the 1670s, within 80 years of its discovery, the dodo had undergone a devastating extinction. But why? The traditional explanation, based on misleading early artwork, was that the dodo was simply inept, fat and easy to kill, an inadequate species. The Dutch only sent it to its inevitable doom. However, the latest scientific evidence reveals the dodo in a new light. It was not the clumsy bird of legend. It was a pigeon that had evolved over some 10 million years into a powerful ground-dwelling creature. So what was the Dutch invaders' real relationship with the dodo? Did they hunt it to extinction? New archaeological evidence is throwing up more surprises. In 1638, the Dutch established a colony on Mauritius as a staging post on the spice route to the Far East. They called their compound Fort Hendrik. Around 100 Dutch colonists logged ebony and maintained the small harbour regularly battered by cyclones.
You can compare it to a spaceship arriving from another planet on a completely unknown planet and bringing everything with them.
Dutch archaeologist Peter Fleurer is now excavating a rubbish dump under the old kitchens to find out how the early colonists fed themselves.
I was expecting to find thousands of dodo bones. Maybe a little bit naive, but on the other hand, because we didn't find any dodo bones over here, and still after 4 years of excavation, we haven't found any dodo bones over here. You have to find an explanation for that.
Could written accounts provide answers? Ship's logs tell us that the crew of the Amsterdam managed to kill a clutch of dodos in the 2 days following their discovery of Mauritius. The sailors were half-starved after 3 weeks drifting across the Indian Ocean. But even so, the dodo didn't go down at all well.
It was so tough We could not cook it properly, but had to eat it half done. Through its oiliness, it cannot choose but quickly cloy and nauseate the stomach.
Examining the skeleton, paleontologist Julian Hume sees why roast dodo would have been an unpalatable dish.
The classic bird part that you eat is obviously the breast, but the dodo had no breast meat. So all of the meat and the fat would have collected on the rump. But this would have made it rather greasy and oily because there was no actual muscle. The legs would have been very muscular, but as the birds aged, they became very sinuous. And so you can understand why these early Dutch sailors did not like to eat them.
Not only did the dodo make a poor meal, it could be awkward prey. Ship's logs describe tussles between sailors and aggressive dodos. They stressed the bird could defend itself.
They are superb and proud, very jaunty and audacious of gait. Their war weapon was the mouth, with which they could bite very fiercely.
So the case against the Dutch as perpetrators of extinction is looking suspect. If the Dutch didn't prize dodo as food, what else could explain the dodo's disappearance? There's a vital clue in the account of the shipwrecked Volker Iversen. When he stumbled across the last dodos, it was on an islet to the east of the main island. It could only be reached at low tide by wading through the shallows. This means that someone or something had driven the dodo off the mainland to this islet. Evidence emerging back at Fort Hendrick suggests what that may be. Peter Fleurer may not be finding dodo remains, but he is frequently digging up other non-native animal bones.
We find so many bones, tens of thousands of bones of non-indigenous species. The Dutch introduced all kinds of animals and plants they thought were useful for new ships coming in, like goats, like pigs. You can imagine that it must have brought quite some harm to the island, the introduction of all these strange animals. Some of them broke loose, raised their young in the wild.
The forests were being invaded by these animal escapees. The dodo had to cope with new competitors, and in one important way, it was peculiarly vulnerable. Being flightless, the dodo raised its young on the ground. Julian believes the dodo was a victim of its own evolutionary success.
Dodos evolved in isolation for millions of years. They never needed to get off the floor. There was no predators. They could have spent a long time rearing their young, perhaps one young every second year. There was no need to propagate themselves in any larger numbers. But then, sadly, pigs arrived.
Mauritius was more than a pigeon paradise. Its rich undergrowth also made it a pig paradise. Of all the animals the Dutch introduced, the impact of ground-rooting pigs on ground-nesting birds would have been devastating. Not only would the pig have competed for food, it may have disrupted age-old mating and egg-laying behavior. Here at last is a powerful explanation for the catastrophic disappearance of the dodo. Pigs would have ravaged the species on the mainland. Unable to rear young on the ground, the aging dodo population was driven to the coast. and confined to islets such as the one Falkar Iverson stumbled upon in 1662. Isolated and aging, the last dodos faced oblivion.
The dodo has this kind of awe about it. It is the extinct species of the world. The term dead as a dodo is often used in reference to it. In fact, this bird was a superior species, perfectly adapted to its environment. Its only downfall was the sheer weight of numbers and aggressiveness of introduced species were just too much for it.
The story of the dodo's annihilation reveals how quickly extinction can overtake a species. And 400 years after it was first discovered, we at last know the dodo's extinction was simply a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. For millions of years, a magnificent animal dominated the northern hemisphere. Thriving on lush Ice Age grasslands, huge herds spread across continents. The mammoth shared a common ancestor with today's elephants. The two species diverged 5 million years ago. But while the elephant has survived, this creature succumbed to extinction. What killed off the mammoth? Nature? Man the hunter? Or something even more destructive? This is the new frontier of mammoth paleontology. Not Siberia, but Mexico City. Here, discoveries are challenging the two heavyweight theories, climate change and human hunting, that have long been invoked in the passionate debate on the demise of the mammoth.
I can imagine mammoths as very noble animals, and to me, to imagine this completely different landscape only 11,000 years ago is quite amazing. I want to find out more, and I want to find out why they died.
Geologist Sylvia Gonzalez lives in Liverpool, but is Mexican by birth. She's returned to Mexico City to study one of the most revealing mammoth graves in the world. This dusty suburb called Toquila seems an unlikely setting for an important archaeological investigation. But in 1996, workmen laying foundations for a new cantina hit something buried 15 feet underground. Archaeologists quickly uncovered over 1,200 bones of what can only be a doomed family group of 7 mammoths.
Toquila is a very important site because we have like an instant photograph of the environment 11,000 years ago, which is preserved.
These remains have been carbon dated to 11,000 years old, the very time when mammoths disappeared. So studying this site is vital to discover if climate change or human hunting wiped out the mammoth. Mammoths are usually associated with the deep freeze of the Siberian steppes. But the American or Columbian mammoth, as scientists classify it, was an even more impressive animal. It weighed almost twice as much as its woolly Siberian cousin. An adult male could stand 13 foot high, and boast spiral tusks over 10 feet long. The basin of Mexico in the late Ice Age. Average temperatures are 10 degrees Celsius, some 5 degrees cooler than today. The Toquila family are on the move. They have the characteristic sloping back and domed head of their species, but their hairy coat has thinned out to adapt to the relative heat of the Americas. Like elephants today, our family migrates hundreds of miles every year to seek out the best places for grazing. They live for up to 70 years and spend 2/3 of every day feeding on grass to sustain their 10-ton bulk. Here at Toquila, the scattered bone bed confirms that Columbian mammoths lived in small family herds. There are the bones of an infant, and this 50-year-old female is believed to be the matriarch who led the group.
We know that elephants living today are very social animals, and we can extrapolate that information, imagine that these mammoths were very sociable as well. And in fact, the evidence from Toquila is telling us that, because we have the social structure of the herd preserved there.
Adult mammoths were impregnable tanks of the plains, but their young took up to 15 years to reach full size and were vulnerable to the Ice Age's most powerful predators. The Toquila family stick together to provide protection. But danger is never far away. A saber-tooth tiger notices the infant has strayed from the herd. The infant runs for its life. The herd is quickly mobilized to form an impenetrable defensive wall. Working together, the herd has little to fear from even the fiercest predators. Yet catastrophe did catch up with this family. How did they end up in this mass grave? Was their death tied up with the extinction of the entire species? At first sight, it would seem more likely that they were killed by a specific local event, because they're buried in volcanic mud.
This is a piece of pumice, volcanic glass, and we know that all of these mammoths are embedded in this material. So this is the evidence for a volcanic mud flow.
Soil deposits reveal that Popocatépetl volcano, only 12 miles from Toquila, was active 11,000 years ago. Were the mammoths killed by a volcanic eruption? The chaotic nature of the bone bed makes Sylvia skeptical.
The main reason to believe that they were not killed by the volcano and the subsequent mud flow is because if that was the case when the animals were alive, you should find the whole complete animal. And in the side, we only have bits and pieces of the body.
This must mean the Toquila mammoths were dead already, their carcasses decaying and easily shattered when the volcano hit them. So the question remains, what killed them in the first place? When it comes to the extinction of the mammoth, one of the heavyweight theories has pointed the finger at climate change. Carbon dating of American finds reveals the number of mammoths dropped as the Ice Age ended and the world warmed up. 20,000 years ago, temperatures started to rise. They rose some 7 degrees Celsius, transforming the American environment. Pollen samples reveal that the grasslands of the American Southwest gave way to the desert of thin scrub and cacti that remains today. The mammoths there could not sustain their diet, and many would have died out. But as a geologist, Sylvia Gonzalez believes the high altitude near Mexico City made it a special case. Soil samples here show it was a kind of oasis.
The basin of Mexico 11,000 years ago was the perfect habitat for these animals. It was a very lush and rich landscape, plenty of grass for them to eat, and was a kind of mammoth Shangri-La.
Climate change couldn't have killed every mammoth. It certainly doesn't solve the particular mystery of Toquila. Scientists have been forced to consider another possibility. No one knows precisely when people first colonized the Americas, but by 12,000 years ago, archaeological sites prove they had spread all the way from Arctic Canada to the tip of South America. If the basin of Mexico was a refuge, a Shangri-La in the desert, man would compete to have a piece of it too. Here was a new, sophisticated predator for the Columbian mammoth to contend with. Did man destroy the mammoths at Toquila? The mammoth thrived for millions of years and spread from southern Europe through Siberia all the way to Central America. But what caused the extinction of this well-adapted giant? Today, it's in Mexico that cutting-edge research is uncovering new clues that shed more light on the traditional theories about what killed the mammoth. In this mammoth graveyard, paleontologists are finding evidence of man's presence.
This is one of the bones that potentially are showing the interaction between humans and mammoths. Over here you can see this sharp edge, and it's possible that humans were breaking the bone to make use of this kind of resource.
The best-known early humans who entered the Americas are known as the Clovis people, after the site in New Mexico where their culture was first uncovered. They had developed a new technology, the fluted flint spear point. These have been found amongst mammoth bones at a handful of sites. For many American archaeologists, there was only one conclusion. Clovis man hunted the mammoth to extinction across the entire continent. The circumstantial evidence seemed compelling. Man arrived just as the mammoth population went into steep decline. But later research calls into question this traditional hunting theory. Paleontologist Eileen Johnson is an expert in bone forensics. Such is the importance of Toquila that she's come from Texas to determine whether this mammoth herd was hunted down by man.
This looks like a tibia that's coming out. This bone was broken fresh. We have really nice helical fractures, and that's kind of the evidence we have here as part of that circling fracture.
For Eileen, the distinctive helical fractures indicate Clovis man was present, breaking these bones sharply to make tools.
Oh, this is a beautiful fracture surface here. This may even be a remnant of the blow, the initial blow.
To test her theory, Eileen tries to replicate the bone fractures she's identified. She uses modern cow bones and a primitive yet effective technology.
And we're going to do a one anvil over the shoulder technique on this one. So you need to hold the femur here so it's steady. You need to come up and take your hand back as far as you can. And then you want to see where you're going to hit it. And then you want to bring the rock down as hard and as fast as you can. Okay, try again, because you've cracked it. Very good. Very, very good. That's a beautiful helical fracture. The force coming down through the hammerstone actually flexes the bone, and you get a rebound action that helps continue that fracture. So basically, they understood physics. Good.
Clovis people splintered mammoth bones to make tools, but that does not necessarily mean they killed the mammoths.
So that's a beautiful technological flake coming out.
To clinch the hunting theory, Eileen would need to find direct evidence of Clovis weapons being used.
At the moment, we have no projectile points, nothing that, no stone tools of that nature. So we cannot say that man played a direct role in the killing of these animals.
Of the 1,500 mammoth sites across North America, just 60 contain any evidence of the presence of man. Of these, only a dozen contain Clovis spear points, proof of hunting. The remainder merely have scavenged broken bones, showing man only made use of them when the mammoths were already dead. The orthodoxy of hunting as a cause of extinction is increasingly being questioned.
When Paleo-Indian studies were beginning in this country, Clovis peoples were looked at as simply mammoth hunters. We're now beginning to move into a much broader view. They hunted horses, they hunted camels, they hunted smaller game, muskrats, ducks, a variety of animals made up their diet.
If Clovis man could sustain himself on animals that were easy to hunt in the lush basin of Mexico, why risk attacking a mammoth? Simple logic makes large-scale hunting of mammoth herds unlikely. The evidence suggests we should rethink the relationship between man and mammoth. Neither climate change nor hunting can provide a full explanation for the mammoth's demise. Evidence like that at Tukwila forces scientists to think again. Amongst the bones, there may be one new lead. This set of lower molars is unusual. While the right side shows healthy normal growth, the left is misshapen and warped.
When you examine the molars, they look deformed, and in other sides as well, not only Tukwila, show us that there are some malformations of the spine, again, malformations of the molars. So there is evidence that they were under stress. And we need to find out what exactly is this stress.
A completely new theory about the mammoth's extinction comes from thousands of miles away and from a different branch of science.
Previously, there were two ideas as to what caused the extinction of mammoths, either climate change or hunting by humans. And now there's a new idea, one that blames humans but in a less direct, more subtle way.
Peter Datchak is not a paleontologist, but a New York-based virologist. His research has brought world attention to bear on a disease so virulent it crosses species barriers and is currently rendering entire populations of frogs extinct. He now believes disease may also have wiped out the mammoths.
If we think about the diseases that we worry about as humans, diseases like flu, these are really diseases of other animals. These are chicken viruses mixing with pig viruses and then infecting humans. AIDS originally, if we believe the current research, came from chimps in Africa. It's very easy for these viruses to jump from one host to another and then expand their range.
Virologists used to believe that a virus would not kill off its host. But Peter has shown that when a disease jumps the species barrier, the result can be more devastating than ever imagined.
As a disease moves into a population that's never experienced it before, either recently or in history, it has no immune response to this pathogen and it can be wiped out very quickly. And this may well be the scenario that allowed a pathogen to wipe out populations of mammoths in North America.
This theory, known as hyperdisease, may help explain the signs of stress evident amongst the Tukwila bones. It also fits with the timing of man's arrival and the decline of the mammoths.
The point about these mammoth populations is that they've never experienced humans before. Humans moved into what are known as naive populations, so they had no defences, and the diseases were quite capable of wiping them out completely.
Back in Mexico, the idea of disease wiping out a population has a special poignancy. When the Spanish conquistadors encountered the Aztecs in the 16th century, the measles and flu they brought with them had more devastating effect than gunshot and sword. But the Aztecs and Spanish met at close quarters. How could Clovis man get close enough to mammoths to transmit disease? Not man, but man's best friend may provide the answer. Clovis man brought the dog to North America. Dogs could carry rabies and distemper that are known to cross species barriers.
As we introduce species like domestic dogs, we also introduce the viruses and the pathogens that these dogs carry. So we spread disease that way. We call this process pathogen pollution, and that's one of the greater implications of the work that we've been doing.
Dogs also transmit disease through fleas.
It may have been that diseases were able to jump host from dogs via fleas into a larger mammal like a mammoth. And certainly as humans moved throughout the North America, dogs would have been able to make close contact with wildlife, and this happens all over the planet right now.
Hyperdisease is a compelling new theory, and virologists are extracting DNA from mammoth bones, looking for sequences that indicate they encountered anthrax, distemper, or herpes. The extinction of the mammoth is one of the most controversial mysteries in paleontology. Climate change and man cannot fully explain it. Now it is time to consider the role of disease in prehistory. In the age of AIDS and Ebola, the bones of Tukwila may be a timely reminder that we must take disease seriously as a possible cause of extinction for any species.
We now know for sure that diseases are capable of wiping out species, and that's a very significant step forward. We really need to use that information to look at how other species became extinct.
In 1844, a group of fishermen rowed out into the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. Their destination was Eldey, a giant sea stack 13 miles off the southwest coast of Iceland. They were risking their lives, driven to find a seabird so rare that a single specimen would raise a small fortune. Clumsy and flightless, once they spotted it, the bird was doomed. The creature they'd killed was called the Great Auk. This was the last confirmed sighting of the species, even though people went on searching for decades. Ironically, the Great Auk had been killed for the very people who most wanted to save it. For millions of years, the North Atlantic was home to one of the most remarkable seabirds ever, the Great Auk. A mere 250 years ago, you could see thousands of them in vast colonies. Now, they're all gone. Today, the only great auks that remain gather dust in Victorian museum collections. Just 80 specimens, all dead, stuffed. They date from the 19th century, when the Great Auk captured the public imagination. Its eggs changed hands for huge sums of money. It even became a brand name. Yet, despite the Victorian fascination with it, the bird was a mystery. Scientists were ignorant of how many there were, where it lived, or how it had evolved, until it was too late. Even the penguin-like appearance of the Great Auk is deceptive. Ornithologist Errol Fuller has studied and collated every stuffed museum specimen known to exist.
The Great Auk is a very interesting example of convergent evolution. It looks very much like a penguin, but in fact it isn't. It's not related to the penguins at all. It's related to the birds that we call now guillemots, razorbills, even puffins. That's where its affinities lie. But it happens to look very much like a penguin because it lived very much the same kind of life.
The auk was larger than the average penguin, and it was a far superior killer. No penguin ever evolved such an effective weapon. A beak, long, sleek, and sharp enough to slice through prey in a single bite. And to chase its victims underwater, it was more agile than the penguin.
At the top of the bird, the beak is compressed so that that doesn't offer much water resistance. Then the bird is generally beautifully streamlined. This bird would have been superbly sleek and hydrodynamic with very small wings so they don't resist against the pull of the water. And when we get to down towards the bottom, the feet are thrown very far back. All those things conspire to make this bird like a torpedo in the water.
Guillemots and razorbills may be the auk's closest living relatives, but there's a crucial difference between them.
This guillemot has very long wings, and that tells us immediately that this is a bird of flight. The wings on the Great Auk are really very, very short, and you see that they couldn't possibly have enabled a bird of this size to take to the air.
The auk and the guillemot were most alike not in the air, but under the water. For biologist Donald Kroll, guillemots and auks stand comparison with the ocean's most magnificent creatures.
We think of sperm whales as being these amazing long-duration divers, and elephant seals, long-duration deep divers. But if you scale it to their body size, you're talking about an animal that weighs thousands of kilos versus a bird that weighs 1 kilo. So pound for pound, what these birds are doing is just absolutely astounding. They're the deepest and longest diving animals that have ever existed on Earth. And so pound for pound, the Great Auk might have even been a better diver.
The auk's much reduced flipper-like wings now had less surface area, enabling the bird to power through water that's many times denser than air. But to dive so deep, it had paid a price.
What these birds did is essentially, in an evolutionary sense, make the great sacrifice. They gave up the ability to fly in order to become the supreme divers, if you will. And so the Great Auks were probably one of the best northern hemisphere divers that existed. And so it really was quite an amazing evolutionary transition.
All this happened to make the Great Auk a devastating underwater predator. For over 10 months of the year, the auk lived entirely in the open ocean, hunting schooling fish like capelin. But the flightlessness that made the Great Auk such a successful underwater hunter also made it uniquely vulnerable. On land, the bird was clumsy and highly at risk from any predator that could get near it. Its only defense was to live as far away from predators as possible, and that wasn't easy.
The Great Auk, of course, was the northern hemisphere's last flightless seabird, and their flightlessness made them vulnerable on a number of levels. One is that they had to breed in areas where they could come ashore without having to fly ashore. So they had to be able to come ashore in some place where there was a beach, and that kind of limited where they could breed.
There were precious few places the flightless Great Auk could have gone. Cliffs and rocky coastlines would have been out of their reach. 40 miles off Newfoundland, on the eastern coast of Canada, lie the Grand Banks. An area of shallows, with an archipelago of tiny islands and drifting icebergs close to where the Titanic went down. For millions of years, this was the auk's stronghold. Ecologist Bill Montevecchia searches for traces of the bird he knows he'll never find alive among the islands.
You know, there's always been a bit of mystery about these birds and about these islands. I still look for them, you know. I mean, I know they're not there. I still look for them, right? I mean, because of that sort of presence of them having been here. Look at these islands here. They're flat. They're just like pancakes. And this is a perfect island for a flightless bird. This is the kind of island that Great Auk had to have.
Isolated and uninhabited, the auk lived here and nowhere else along the North American coast, undisturbed for millennia. But 500 years ago, it suddenly came under attack.
In here is a skull of a Great Auk that I dug on Funk Island. This is the beak. Quite incredible, powerful beak. This was all one piece that actually subsequently fragmented. There's a few cracks in the cranium of the bird here. It might have been where it was banged over the head.
Out here, only one predator could have done this: man. In the 16th century, explorers set off from all over Europe to cross the Atlantic in search of the New World. Frenchman Jacques Cartier was one of them. After sailing for months across the uncharted ocean in search of the Northwest Passage, his ship came across these islands. For the half-starved crew, what they found here proved a godsend.
The crews are stressed for protein, for food, 6 to 8 week crossings of an Atlantic Ocean that's tough. You don't have a refrigerator. You've got dried meat, you've got salted meat, and you're lucky to be alive by the time you get to this side. So Cartier's sailing over here, up on the northeast coast, he finds this flat island covered with flightless birds. I mean, he couldn't have hit anything any better. For centuries, you know, this flat island really was first fast food takeout in North America.
Hunted for food, the Great Auk suddenly turned from predator to prey. Yet its extinction is no open and shut case. Ultimately, was man the scientist more to blame than man the hunter? The Great Auk was the only flightless seabird ever to exist in the Northern Hemisphere. 500 years ago, the flat islands off the coast of Newfoundland would have been covered with millions of them. Ecologist Bill Montevecchia knows that it had taken to the water so completely, only one thing brought the Great Auk to land: sex.
If they didn't have to, great auks would never come to islands. And what compels them to come there is because they have to lay their eggs on solid land. It's also where they meet their mates and copulate and produce that egg in the first instance.
For many seabirds, the huge population density of the colony is necessary for successful reproduction. Like guillemots, auks may well have paired for life. As this female's breeding partner approaches, she wobbles and gurgles to greet him. He taps his beak against hers, and they preen each other. They'll incubate the egg for about 40 days, taking turns to keep it warm while the other one looks for food. The swap over is a painstaking business and can be perilous. But not as perilous as what was about to happen. With the arrival of hungry sailors, the Great Auk had to cope with a threat that evolution had not prepared it for. Flightless and unable to escape, they made easy pickings. Thousands were slaughtered summer after summer. Yet killing auks for food was only the beginning of the end.
We don't think that's why there are no great auks here today. We think it was a systematic killing that occurred in the 1700s when crews of men went there to live there, to stay there, to slaughter these birds for a very specific reason.
That reason was fashion. 200 years after Europeans first arrived, the killing changed gear as hunters switched their attention from food to feathers. Auk feathers were sold to make mattresses and even became fashionable in ladies' hats. Thousands of birds were captured, killed, and dumped into cauldrons, where they were boiled just long enough to make their feathers easy to pluck. In the thin covering of soil on the islands, Bill has uncovered physical evidence of the carnage.
Got some metal pieces and plates that were pieces of cauldrons that perhaps were used to parboil the birds to get to the down underneath the waterproof feathers. Also, this hook, which I presume was a hook that would have, maybe held the cauldron over a fire where the birds could have been parboiled. The oily, fatty birds were used as the fuel to keep the fires burning, and you can actually find these pieces of charcoal. And if you look really carefully, you can see where the feather shafts of the birds were. It was that real systematic, overkilling of the animals.
In 1785, Captain George Cartwright, adventurer and trapper, observed,
"It has been customary of late years for crews of men to live all summer on the island for the sole purpose of killing birds for the sake of their feathers. The destruction which they have made is incredible. If a stop is not soon put to that practice, the whole breed will be diminished to almost nothing."
And that's exactly what happened. By the 19th century, the vast colonies on the islands off Newfoundland had been completely destroyed. But the species survived. There was still hope. Across the Atlantic was one other refuge.
The last great auks off the fishing banks of Newfoundland were seen in the mid-19th century, but really the species had ceased to breed there, and the only remaining breeding colony of the great auk in the whole world was on a tiny island off the southwestern tip of Iceland. But it was about 26 miles from the mainland, so it was a dangerous procedure to go out there.
Isolated from the threat of man, in Iceland it seemed the great auk had finally found a safe haven. And for hundreds of years, Icelandic folklore even helped protect this colony from humans, who were too scared to go there.
This little island was invested with quite fearful stories. People had died going out there in the 1620s. There were stories going back to the 14th century of somebody who lived there and survived a winter, refused to tell anybody how he'd survived. So the story grew up that he'd been looked after by the Hilda folk, who were these fairies and ghosts.
These haunted islands protected the birds, but then nature, not man, dealt them another blow. In March 1830, an undersea volcano erupted. The auk's refuge exploded and disappeared beneath the waves. But even the hand of nature couldn't drive the auk to total extinction. About 40 pairs survived the eruption.
The birds had one other place that they could breed on, which they never had bred on, because it was 13 kilometers nearer to the mainland and not ideally suitable. But this was the one that they chose after 1830. The bird really didn't have much chance of survival once it had chosen a breeding site that was so near to the mainland.
This last haven was Eldey, and the auk sought refuge here just as scientific interest and sympathy for its plight was growing. Yet at this time, the study of natural history meant collecting and classifying, pickling, preserving, and stuffing. The rarer the auk became, the more sought after it was.
This was the golden era of natural history collecting, when every gentleman worth his salt would feel the need to put together a large collection of natural history items, stuffed animals, stuffed birds, birds' eggs, and at the same time the great institutional museums of the world were becoming interested in natural history specimens. So the Great Auk, of course, in its declining years, corresponded with just these years when this great surge in natural history collecting was taking place.
But in their enthusiasm for collecting, Victorian scientists neglected animal behavior and failed to understand that with the loss of the auk's breeding colonies, it was already on the very brink of extinction.
Once the numbers fell below a certain level, even though that level may have been quite considerable, the bird was doomed. And we can almost test that, because if this had been a bird that could have lived in 3s and 4s, 6s and 7s, 10s and 12s, it would still be among us today, because it could have always found little lonely coves, lonely islands in the North Atlantic where just a few individuals could live. The fact that we don't find it today is proof, surely, of the fact that this was a bird that could only live in colonies of large numbers.
This was a fatal misunderstanding, because now, in their ignorance, Victorian scientists unwittingly pushed the Great Auk to its final extinction. On Eldey in 1844, the hunting trip was undertaken at the request of a keen Danish collector of rare birds and their eggs, Carl Siemsen. One of dozens of dealers across Europe, he believed he was furthering the cause of scientific knowledge, as well as making a handsome profit.
Birds like this one, and all the ones we see in museums, almost without exception, were caught on the island of Eldey. They were caught by Icelandic fishermen who landed on the island with a certain amount of difficulty, actually approached the bird, grabbed it because it was so helpless, on land, unlike in the water, probably wrung its neck there and then on LD, took it back to their fishing village, skinned it, ate the body, and then sold the skin for comparatively small amounts to traders in Reykjavik, who then sold them on to museums in Europe.
By 1844, far from providing a refuge, LD was more like a prison, where the last remaining breeding pair of auks awaited the inevitable. Even then, no one realized that the Great Auk was now extinct. It was confidently asserted that colonies thrived even further north in Arctic waters. Scientific interest continued unabated.
It wasn't perhaps till a decade after the Great Auk actually became extinct that scientists went to Iceland seriously looking for it. And by then, of course, it was too late for them to find it.
As the years went by, the very scarcity of the bird only managed to increase demand for dead specimens, driving prices higher and higher.
It started off at amounts like £5, £10, but by say 1870 you'd have got £40 for a Great Auk. By 1900 you'd have got £350 for a Great Auk. Now £350 was a huge sum of money at that time. Just to put it into context, you'd have probably been able to buy 3 or 4 houses with that amount of money.
Auk mania ensured the bird was never more famous than the moment of its extinction. In the 1880s, novelist Charles Kingsley caricatured the bird standing on the All Alone stone in his children's classic, The Water Babies. The Great Auk had become a mythical creature, but the opportunity to experience it for real had been lost forever. After 100,000 years, the Ice Age is coming to an end. This treeless grassland is the domain of a spectacular creature. A creature which ranged across Europe from the French Pyrenees to the Russian steppes, but in Ireland it found a homeland which human hunters had not reached. It has antlers so vast and elaborate, they stretch 12 feet from tip to tip. They are the crowning glory of the magnificent Irish elk. But this giant deer has presented science with an intractable mystery. Why, having flourished for millennia, did it undergo catastrophic extinction? Were its massive antlers to blame?
The Irish elk has a sort of iconic status among Irish biologists, and it seems to me that it's a great animal to study the great themes of evolution. For example, how did it get to be as it is? And in this particular case, how did it die?
A disused army barracks in the heart of Dublin is the final resting place for prehistoric remains which have been excavated over the last 200 years. Paleontologist Tom Hayden has come to take a closer look. Stored here are the peat-blackened remains of hundreds of Irish elk, which died between 10 and 15,000 years ago. The stag skulls are extraordinary, boasting the largest antlers of any deer that has ever existed.
This is what all the fuss has been about. A male Irish elk. This animal had antlers which weighed about 40 kilos and measured, in large specimens, 12 feet from end to end. I could stretch myself along the antlers from one tip to the other twice.
No modern animal comes close. To find out how it coped with such a massive burden, Tom needs to examine a fully assembled skeleton. It's clear that the Irish elk had specialized, evolving a physique capable of supporting its vast antlers.
There's a massive rib cage. And this, in life, of course, supported a very large heart and very large lungs. And this is what we would expect for an animal that had a lifestyle like the giant deer. An open plains runner, probably high stamina, and this essentially is typical of an aerobic machine. And now we come to the more spectacular end of the animal, where we find the antlers. And quite apart from being extremely heavy, they're also extremely awkward, because a lot of the weight is a long way away from the center of the animal's body. So it's like holding very large buckets at arm's length and trying to maneuver them. It puts a lot of torsion and stresses on its neck. And for that reason, the vertebrae in its neck are very large, quite strong, to try and cope with the stresses and strains of moving this great weight about. Behind the neck, the spines and the vertebrae are very, very tall. And in life, these would have acted as anchor points for a system of cables, ligaments, which ran from here to the neck and helped the animal to raise it and move it around.
Antlers place a further demand on a deer. It must shed and regrow them each year. So how did the Irish elk fuel the growth of their unusually massive antlers? What did they eat? Tom Hayden is looking for clues amongst the teeth of a mature stag skull.
These white enamel ridges have very, very fine scratches, and there is only one substance we know about which will produce these scratches, and that is grass. Grass has silica particles in between the cells which act like sandpaper as far as the teeth are concerned. And if you look at the enamel on a giant deer and compare it to the enamel on a cow, they're identical. So this is strong evidence to suggest that they ate mainly grass.
Pollen samples reveal late Ice Age Ireland was an open, treeless landscape. Its abundant grasslands rich in nutrients like calcium. A perfect environment for the bulk grass feeding the Irish elk's antlers require. Back in the 19th century, Charles Darwin's detractors seized upon these antlers to attack his heretical theory of natural selection. If the survival of the fittest really designed animals to survive, what possible advantage could such an extravagant burden provide? They used the Irish elk to cast doubt on Darwin's theory. To this day, researchers continue to question how natural selection could have produced such large antlers. Why invest so much in them? What was their purpose? Paleontologist Adrian Lister believes that today's fallow deer can provide vital clues.
The bucks have got their antlers about half grown, but you can already see the way the antlers grow horizontally out from the head, just like in the Irish elk. There they go.
He's conducted anatomical studies that have thrown up a surprising result. They reveal the tiny fallow deer is a distant cousin of the Irish elk.
The Irish elk has got particularly strongly developed neck vertebrae, which were to hold up the very heavy head with the weight of the antlers. And the fallow deer, if we look at the neck vertebrae, have got the same structures, although of course they haven't got such heavy antlers now. They've got the similar structure, and that proves the relationship.
But can the fallow deer provide an insight into how Irish elk stags use their vast antlers? Sex may provide the answer. Fallow deer have a mating system called lecking, in which females move among the stags and choose their mate on the merits of his antlers.
In the fallow deer, the male will do a kind of display, moving his head from side to side, and he's got these flattened palmations of the antlers which will be shown off in that way to the female who's following on behind him. With the Irish elk, with the flattened parts going straight out horizontally like that, and also being so large, maybe the animal didn't have to do that kind of behaviour. Just standing there would have been impressive enough. If the female was interested enough, then mating would ensue.
The huge palms of the stag's antlers flash like mirrors across the open landscape, attracting a female willing to mate. For females, the choice is simple because, for them, bigger antlers indicate a fitter male. So the genes of large antlered males were continually passed on. Sexual selection was driving the development of these enormous antlers. For over 100 years, scientists denied the antlers could have any other role. Now biomechanics expert Andrew Kitchener can prove they were also deadly weapons.
What my research has shown is that the antlers are not just designed for display. There's too much material in here to just be used as an elaborate advertisement hoarding. They're designed for fighting, both at the structural level as to how they actually fit together, and also at the mechanical level. They are actually strong enough to take the massive forces that would have been produced in fighting.
The highest density of bone occurs where the antlers impact and lock together. From his observations of other deer, Andrew has demonstrated how these points, known as tines, could be used for defense and attack. In the mating season, stags challenge each other for the right to mate. At first, the stags size each other up. But what would happen if battle commenced?
The next stage would be to twist the head right round, drop it down to the ground so that the nose points back between the front legs. And now you can see the different parts of the antler coming into function for fighting. Here we have the brow tines and also the secondary tines, which act in a defensive way. They protect the head and the eye from accidental injury if the antlers were to slip against each other. And on the outside, on the palms here, we have these very long offensive tines which point in towards the neck and the flank of the opponent. And during fighting, the aim is to try and wrestle your opponent off balance and hopefully knock him over so that you can use these tines to actually stab your opponent in the flank or the neck.
Andrew's research reveals stag fights would have been brutal and violent. This stag has proved he is the alpha male and secured his access to the females. In attracting a mate and fighting off rivals, the antlers were the key to passing on an individual stag's genes. But could this design have also brought the Irish elk's downfall? Carbon dating of the Dublin bones reveals that 10,500 years ago it vanished from Ireland. Why, just as the Ice Age was ending and conditions improved, did the Irish elk face extinction? "11,000 years ago, the Ice Age was coming to an end. Rising global temperatures pushed back the icy tundra that had stretched across northern Europe. In Ireland, the Irish elk, a giant deer with vast antlers, had evolved to graze the rich Ice Age grassland. Irish elk were once plentiful. Over 100 individuals have been excavated from one peat bog alone. But around 10,600 years ago, the fossil record reveals the Irish elk disappeared suddenly and completely. What caused this catastrophic decline? Geologist Pete Coxon is trying to find out. He's investigating what happened to the local climate in Ireland at the end of the Ice Age. Almost 3 meters below the surface, he finds soil which dates back 11,000 years to the late Ice Age, when the Irish elk was still thriving. These late Ice Age soils are rich in pollen. They show it was cooler than today, but there was abundant grassland.
You see organic sediment being laid down with seeds and bits of leaf and so on. And in this core we can even pick out fragments of plant, fossils of plant. There's some cuticle there of a grass or a sedge.
When Pete takes a sample from slightly higher up and 400 years later, the very end of the Ice Age, there's a dramatic change. The grass pollen has been replaced by eroded rock and sand. For Pete, it's evidence of an unexpected climate change that wiped out vegetation.
We see in this section this very sudden cold snap. You see sand and inorganic material in here. You get a lot of erosion, a lot of movement of soil down the slope, and that's why we see these inorganic sediments. And this cold snap lasted 1,000 years. Temperatures 7 degrees colder than the present day. Suddenly, the biological productivity plummets.
Ironically, as the rest of the world warmed up at the end of the Ice Age, Ireland was hit locally by severe cold. It seems to defy logic. But the sea provides an answer. As rising temperatures melted the great polar ice caps, cold water flooded into the Atlantic Ocean, cooling it by an estimated 8 degrees Celsius. Warm Gulf Stream currents flowing up from the tropics were blocked. Ireland lost its central heating and was plunged into freezing conditions. In a severe cold period, stags with smaller antlers, less of a burden, would have had a better chance of surviving. Natural selection would predict they would now be the fittest. But is there any evidence that the Irish elk evolved to become smaller? Tom Hayden has measured hundreds of antlers from this crucial period. But he can't find any indication that they were shrinking. Ironically, sexual instinct may have outweighed survival instinct.
The Irish elk was caught in a dilemma, in a sense. It was being forced in one direction to maintain large size and large antlers at a very expensive cost by sexual selection. And on the other hand, natural selection would have been dictating a downsizing, a smaller animal, smaller antlers, a less expensive lifestyle. Unfortunately, it couldn't make that transition.
In the grip of sudden climate change, it appears the Irish elk could not evolve quickly enough. Ten and a half thousand years ago, the Irish elk succumbed to extinction. For scientists, that's long been the end of the story. But bones stored here are adding a new twist to the case of the Irish elk. They're not from Ireland, they're from the Isle of Man, which was then connected to Britain by a land bridge. In 2000, Adrian Lister started to carbon date Irish elk remains from northern Britain. The result from the Manx skeleton was a bombshell.
We've got the radiocarbon dates back from the lab, and amazingly they show that this Irish elk skull is the latest one that we have from anywhere in the world. This specimen is only 9,200 years old. And so this specimen shows that the species did actually survive for nearly 1,500 years longer than we'd previously imagined.
The question is, why? Ireland's cold spell had been severe but local. To the east of Ireland, the Isle of Man and southern Scotland were more sheltered, and Irish elk here must have been able to cling on for another 1,500 years. Yet these late dates mean that the remaining Irish elk may have encountered a new threat. At Edinburgh University, archaeologists are sifting through the debris from a human encampment. Clear evidence that late Stone Age hunters had reached southern Scotland at the same time as the remaining Irish elk were escaping the cold. Did they hunt them down? Intrigued by this possibility, Adrian Lister goes to examine the Edinburgh evidence to search for signs that man hunted the remaining Irish elk.
There's a deer tooth, that's a red deer upper molar. That's a deer humerus, forearm bone. That's red deer size. That's a little bit of the bottom end of a so-called cannon bone, which is the lower leg bone. Again, that's red deer. There's a clear impression here that red deer is the dominant prey animal.
There are plenty of deer bones, but no sign of Irish elk at this site. No hard evidence to point the finger at man. What else could explain the animal's final extinction? Yet again, were its giant antlers implicated? 10,000 years ago, the landscape across Britain and Ireland was transformed once more.
It's so dramatic, it's like a light switch clicking on. And instantly, this landscape is warm, the soils begin to form, and any plant that's close by will suddenly be able to colonise that landscape. So by this point, 9,500 years ago, find a piece of pine wood. There you can see the nice bright red colour in the bark. And right at the very top of the core here is the shell of part of a hazelnut.
Grasslands gave way to forests after the Ice Age. At first, birch, pine and hazel. But by 9,200 years ago, even oak was colonising northern Britain. Ironically, Adrian Lister believes the changing countryside may have brought further problems for the Irish elk.
The kind of habitat the Irish elk liked was lots of open grassy areas where it could graze, but it wouldn't have liked the dense forests that started to grow up as the climate warmed in the present interglacial. Dense forest didn't give it the variety of food, especially grass, that it liked. Also, of course, with those very huge antlers, they would have been an encumbrance in the forest and also would have put the Irish elk under pressure as its preferred habitat shrunk and shrunk.
The warming climate would have sealed the animal's fate. As the ice caps melted, sea levels were rising some 30 feet every 1,000 years. The Irish Sea was created, and new islands like the Isle of Man appeared. The remaining Irish elk were split into small vulnerable groups, literally marooned. This may have had disastrous consequences for the gene pool.
If they're in a situation where they can't easily exchange genes between the populations, then the relic populations may become inbred, and that's not healthy either, especially if they're in a situation where they would need to adapt quite quickly to changing conditions. They may not have the genetic resources to do that.
9,000 years ago, the remaining pockets of Irish elk were on the brink of extinction. It had prospered for tens of thousands of years. But finally, climate change isolated the Irish elk in small populations, struggling in an increasingly forested landscape. Evolution had crafted a highly specialized animal, dependent on open grassland to nourish its extraordinary antlers.
Clearly, the general design and lifestyle of the Irish elk was tremendously successful while the going was good. And they, in a sense, specialized for this high life. And then suddenly, when the climate changes, they're almost locked into this expensive lifestyle and they can't pay the bills anymore.
The case of the Irish elk reveals that, faced with a changing world, too highly evolved a design can actually prove an animal's undoing.
Specialized animals are usually the ones that go to the wall first. The generalists, like the meek, inherit the earth.
In 1930, Tasmanian farmer Wilf Batty had a fateful encounter with an extraordinary creature. What Batty couldn't know was his gunshot didn't merely end the life of a single animal. It marked the death knell for an entire species. The Tasmanian tiger. Tasmania lies 200 kilometers off the south coast of Australia. An isolated wilderness the size of Ireland, it's famed for its supreme predator. A bizarre creature, it had the body of a wolf and huge jaws, its ultimate weapon. The stripes on its rear earned it the name Tasmanian Tiger. But the most amazing thing about this wolf-like predator is that it wasn't a tiger at all. It was more kangaroo than canine, a wolf with a pouch. A combination which would lead to it becoming one of the most hated and misunderstood animals in history. Ironically, despite its recent extinction, today the Tasmanian tiger is celebrated everywhere on the island. A far cry from the scientific ignorance prevalent while there was still time to save it.
Humans failed at this animal really badly. In particular, scientists failed it really badly. They had the knowledge to save it. But at the same time, deep within themselves, they accepted the idea that extinction was inevitable.
This is the story of an animal that became extinct because humans didn't understand it. It was new to them, and it was different. It was a marsupial.
The whole concept of marsupial inferiority was accepted by scientists. They expected marsupial animals to be weaker, less fit, less capable of surviving, certainly less capable of surviving when Europeans and European animals entered their environment.
During the age of the dinosaurs, marsupials evolved away from other mammals. Isolated in Australia, they developed a unique way of nurturing their young. Instead of growing fully inside the womb, the fetus leaves the mother's body and continues its growth in a pouch. Scientists originally dismissed marsupials like the Tasmanian tiger as primitive and inferior. It's only now, after its extinction, they are studying it properly, using some extraordinary evidence. It died out so recently, amazingly, it was captured on film. For tiger expert Nick Mooney, this is testimony not of an inferior creature, but an extraordinary one.
This tiger was called Ben. We can see the very thick base of the tail and the stripes, very characteristic of Tasmanian tigers. The tiger's walking rather like a dog on its toes, but the pattern of walking is quite different. There does seem an awkwardness, and dogs seem to be more rigid than this animal. This animal seems to have to me, a beautiful fluidity about it when it walks. You notice the animal yawning there. It had the largest gape of any land mammal. They must have had the mother of all bites, these things.
Film footage can tell us about the animal's appearance and behavior in captivity, but it can only go skin deep. Superficially, the Tasmanian tiger may look like Nick's dog, but closer inspection reveals just how much of a remarkable evolutionary mixture this animal really was.
There's some immediate similarity with a dog skeleton, but there's also some really important differences. You notice this tail has very long vertebrae, and it makes the tail very, very stiff, whereas a dog tail is extremely flexible. So looking at the whole skeleton, we have the impression here of an animal with quite a flexible, supple front end. Short vertebrae, and lots of them here. But as soon as we get about halfway down the animal, suddenly the vertebrae become much longer. The other half of it seems to be much less flexible, and in fact, if you cut this in half, you could be excused for thinking the front half and the back half belong to different animals. There's a fundamental change in flexibility from supple to very stiff here. So this is fairly good evidence that the Tasmanian tiger evolved from a hopping ancestor like a kangaroo. As we go forward, the animal seems much more like a dog, a big head with lots of teeth. We have a lot of muscle attachments here to hold that head, a long neck. This was the main fighting end, the main killing end of the animal.
Evolving on opposite sides of the planet, the Tasmanian tiger and the dog adopted a similar design for the same reasons: to chase and kill. But how efficient a predator was the tiger? In the absence of any proper scientific study of the animal before its extinction, this isn't easy to find out. But there is one extraordinary marsupial that might shed light on the question: the Tasmanian devil. DNA analysis reveals that it is one of the Tasmanian tiger's closest living relatives. Devils give zoologist Menna Jones an insight that neither footage nor bones can. First, how it might have stalked its victim.
The tiger was probably not a fast-running predator, not like a wolf. If you look at the skeletal proportions of a tiger and compare these with a wolf and with other marsupial carnivores, they are far more similar to the devil. They had a relatively long foot compared to the thigh bone, and this means they don't run very fast. And the devil doesn't run very fast, but they make up for this with endurance. They can run for a very, very long time.
In the forest, animals are becoming active again after the heat of the day. This mature female is 3 years old. She's made a lair in a small cave, a shelter where she'd be able to rear future cubs. A solitary territorial predator, Each day she stalks the forest for prey, her tail stripes helping to keep her camouflaged. Her favorite victims are wallabies, possums, and kangaroos. Picking up a scent, she begins her pursuit. Easily pursuing the wallaby for hours through forests, rivers, and valleys, her sheer stamina means eventually she'll corner her prey. Now the wallaby is exhausted. It can run no more. But Menner's work comparing devils to the tiger reveals that when it came to eating prey, the two animals were very different. Devils crunch bones like carrots, but the Tasmanian tiger preferred other body parts.
If you look at the lower jaw of a devil, the canine teeth in an adult animal are often broken and they're quite blunt. And most of the molar teeth are also quite blunt. This is because the devil is a bone crusher and it wears its teeth down and it breaks its teeth eating bone. The tiger, even in an adult animal, an adult tiger, has quite sharp canines, they're not broken, and all of the molar teeth remain sharp right through its life. This indicates that the tiger probably ate the soft tissues of the animal, the muscle tissue and the guts, but it probably didn't eat much in the way of bone.
Having crushed and suffocated the animal with her powerful jaws, she uses her sharp teeth to pick out the most tender parts of the kill, the vital organs, the liver, heart, and lungs. But despite her successful hunt, the tiger and the rest of her species are living on borrowed time. Its wilderness home was suddenly invaded by the modern world, and the Tasmanian tiger was about to become an object of fear and loathing in the human imagination. The modern history of Tasmania began in 1803 with the establishment of a harsh British penal colony, and some of the earliest encounters with the animal were made by convicts on the run. Convicts often escaped in the forlorn hope they could walk to China or India. Most perished. Some were even forced into cannibalism. One account, written in 1805 after the recapture of two men, describes how they'd returned to risk the cat-o'-nine-tails rather than face what they'd seen.
They informed me that when they were in the wood they saw a large tiger. I make no doubt, but here are many wild animals which we have not yet seen.
This was the first time in recorded history that the animal's stripes led to it being mistaken for a tiger. From that moment on, in the minds of Tasmanians, the tiger became a monster to be feared and killed.
Europeans came from a recent history of having exterminated wolves, lions, every possible predator and dangerous animal, and the Tasmanian tiger suffered exactly that fate.
Yet the precise role humans played in the tiger's demise is still steeped in controversy.
By the end of the 19th century, the Tasmanian tiger is in a lot of trouble. But it's not just the humans out there in the bush and in the farming land which are causing the problem. There's a lot more to the story than that.
By the 1880s, vast swathes of Tasmania had been transformed into pasture to graze millions of sheep brought to the island. This was the beginning of the end for the tiger. Farmers were now on the tiger's hunting grounds, and they were horrified by the discovery of dismembered sheep. Blaming it for the killings, the tiger became their sworn enemy.
In the Tasmanian archives here is this paper trail of evidence about how the animal was hated and feared. Here we have a petition submitted to the government for destroying native tigers. In fact, it reads, "We shall have to abandon the Crown lands occupied by us and give up sheep farming altogether unless some means can be devised for combating this evil." Petitions like this signed by dozens of influential landowners, of course, are very powerful things in the earlier colonial days.
It was this kind of pressure from the farmers which eventually forced the government to act. In 1888, a public bounty of £1 was introduced for every Tasmanian tiger caught and killed.
So this went on, and here's a government voucher to pay Mr. Brooks in 1894 10 shillings for destroying one half-grown native tiger, a full-grown tiger being worth £1.
By the end of the 19th century, the Tassie tiger had been indiscriminately slaughtered, both by individuals, encouraged by the Tasmanian government's bounty, which at its peak, the government was paying a bounty on a Tasmanian tiger once every 2 days.
Ironically, the killing was actually unnecessary.
The losses attributed to Tasmanian tigers were greater than the whole population of sheep in some districts. Like, it was quite absurd. The Tasmanian tiger killed some sheep, without question, but it made the perfect scapegoat for general mismanagement. And that mismanagement often came about because people were farming in very unfamiliar areas using unfamiliar techniques.
But out in the bush, trapping tigers had become a lucrative industry. And it wasn't just money that drove the killing. Continued scientific ignorance also played a part. With no studies of the animal in the wild, no one knew exactly how many tigers there actually were, and no one could judge just how the killing was affecting their survival. As the top predator, its numbers would have always been limited. Perhaps no more than 3,000 individuals. As many as 2/3 of these may have been wiped out in the bounty years. At the time, few cared.
People didn't understand marsupials. Europeans didn't really have empathy. We're not marsupials, so there's not that basic empathy. We get on so well with dogs because we're not that different from a dog in our social organisation. They're essentially all very social species, and none of the marsupials were. So marsupials didn't cooperate with us.
Marsupial inferiority provided an excuse to accept what was happening, an excuse for scientists to suggest it was inevitable, to possibly put less effort than they might have into saving the species.
In 1909, the final chapter in the extinction of the tiger began to unfold.
100 or so Tasmanian tigers per year were being killed, and this seemed a fairly steady number. But then the population crashed, and crashed very, very suddenly.
In 1909, the killing rate collapsed from 100 each year to just 1. A drastic fall, suggesting it wasn't only trapping that was destroying them.
It was not persecuted over large amounts of its range, and even if we'd lost all the animals in those settled areas, there still should have been a trickle of immigration from those more remote areas. But the fact is, the population seemed to have radically decreased all over its range in Tasmania. History has shown that hunting and trapping alone rarely drives anything to extinction or even near extinction. So something else happened.
The rapid decline suggests something far more deadly than even humans.
It can only have been a disease, and in fact there were sick and dead animals reported with symptoms rather like canine distemper.
Canine distemper is an airborne virus. The initial symptom is fever before a painful death involving discharge from the eye, diarrhea, vomiting, and seizures. Yet marsupials are known to suffer similar viruses all the time without being wiped out. Why might this outbreak have been so devastating?
Almost certainly, if there was no hunting or habitat loss, the disease would have been of little consequence to the population. We think it was probably a viral pneumonia, something reasonably common in marsupials. But in the fragmented state, the fragile state this Tasmanian tiger population was in, that this disease probably started that last drum roll of extinction.
The female tiger is ready to mate, but hunting and disease means she can't find a male. And she herself is now sick. The tiny wild population can no longer replace itself. Extinction now looms. Yet there was one last chance to save the animal. As the Tasmanian tiger got rarer, it became more and more famous.
To me, it's also ironic that science played, or so-called science, played a part in the demise of the Tasmanian tiger, in that when people realised this animal looked like becoming extinct, there was this mad rush to catch every last one and put it in a zoo or a collection.
By 1930, the majority of tigers known to still exist lived protected in zoos, yet this wasn't seen as an opportunity to save them.
There was no attempt at all to breed them. There was no attempt at all to do something as obvious and as sensible as breeding them in captivity.
Remaining unbred in captivity, most zoo specimens had died by the 1930s, and sightings in the wild were very rare. At last, there were calls for its protection, though still no one recognized that the Tasmanian tiger was on the very brink of extinction. For farmers, it was still vermin to be exterminated. At Wilf Batty's farm, weakened by disease and desperate for food, the female is driven to go after the easiest prey. What Farmer Batty didn't know was that he had just shot the last Tasmanian tiger ever seen in the wild. At this moment, the tiger passed from reality to myth. Still, no one believed the tiger was extinct, and in the years since then, many have claimed to have seen the animal. It's become a sort of Tasmanian Bigfoot or Loch Ness Monster, but no sightings have ever been proved.
A lot of the reports of people seeing Tasmanian tigers, lots of that sort of anecdotal evidence is definitely a reflection of a yearning to have this animal back.
But no one has seen a live tiger for over half a century.
It's reasonable enough to invoke the 50-year criterion, which says there's been no evidence for 50 years that the animal is extinct.
After Batty shot the last wild tiger, the only individual left was Ben, penned up in Hobart Zoo.
I've sat and watched this black and white film many times, and at times it makes me quite angry. There's still people exist now that would probably exterminate it all over again if they had the chance. Not everyone feels guilty about it. There's a lot of people scattered around the world that don't want big predators about.
There were two final twists. Ben had been misidentified. He wasn't a male tiger, and on the 7th of September 1936, she died. Ironically, for her last 59 days, she'd enjoyed full legal protection as an endangered species.